I find this extremely interesting. And I find it interesting from the perspective of that it demonstrates to me how ill-prepared we are for the future and for the jobs of the future, starting with education. And I suppose my first question would be, are we changing the curriculums fast enough to meet the new jobs of the future? And if we're not, why aren't we? And are there some countries who are changing fast enough that we could learn from? So maybe just that question first around education. What are the subjects that we need to be doing across the board?
No, thank you very much for this question. And indeed, in some sense, it gets to the core of when people think of technology, typically it's presented, at least in much of the economics writings, but also business school writings, as it's machines versus workers. What we find in our report is that there are a number of economists, not many, you're correct about that, that as they upgrade their human capital, basically their education systems, and I'll speak in which ways in a minute, actually they manage to benefit tremendously from new technology and in some sense bring business that previously was not in these economies, bring business both from richer countries but also from emerging economies. Much of this is happening in East Asia. So East Asia is not just China, but Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Korea, economies that we document in the report are really pulling in extra business. How are they doing this? It's exactly what you mentioned. Their educational systems seem to be a lot more nimble than ours, by ours I mean European ones, in terms of reflecting the need for new skills. What are these new skills? We actually extensively write in the World Development Report. As I mentioned already, transitions between and across jobs and across sectors actually are becoming much faster than they were in the past. What does this imply for the education systems is that this what's called vertical system, where you decide at age 15, let's say, that you want to be an engineer or an economist like myself, and you pursue engineering or economics degree by taking the right type of courses in high school and then university. That type of vertical system is not particularly responsive to technology, because technology is developing quite fast, and many of the skills that we thought we required, and this actually applies for high-level engineering as well, for sophisticated jobs, not just for menial jobs. By the time that our kids graduate from college, in some sense, they're already obsolete. So first, what can be done and what can be done specifically in Ireland. So we observe that many of the countries that are becoming more and more globally competitive don't even wait to high school to prepare their kids for the future of work. Already preschool in particular is the area where a lot of investment in human capital is going on. So one answer is, rather than looking at tertiary education, particularly university education and adult learning after that as the way to be preparing for the future, we and you as policymakers should, in my view, look much earlier and say, you know, kids are starting to learn technology. You have kids or maybe even grandkids, I'm sure. You can probably attest that they know technology much better than you do. So, you know, a 4-year-old knows how to use technology better than all of us. It's just their mind is wired this way. And we actually use a lot of the latest evidence to say what are the best years to learn technology. They're not what we thought until now, sort of high school, college, years 3 to 6. So that means that by the time you're already at even primary education, it's too late. You need to think of how to do it at the preschool years, and that's actually one big focus of the World Bank going forward, to work with governments to design programs before age 6 or 7. So that's one focus. And then on the curricula specifically, what we find is that as I mentioned, vertical curricula where you're studying just engineering doesn't work. It needs to be much more flexible, meaning multidisciplinary. But not only that, the so-called soft skills, this term was used in the past to basically mean social-emotional skills, how you prepare for teamwork, especially if your team is half here, half in Germany. Some people are in the US, some people are in Romania. Basically, this ability to work using new technology, both to work independently but also work in virtual teams. The current curricular, in Europe especially, is totally unprepared for this. So as a result, we have very good technical experts who cannot work at the pace of either American companies, so to speak, or Asian companies, which is why, incidentally, and we have it in our report, of the top 100, so to speak, platform companies, the most high-tech global companies in the world, only 9 are European, so very, very few. So what does this mean? To summarize, much more focus on the early years, so before you go to primary school, and then curricula in high school especially and the university, a lot more multidisciplinary and a lot more focus not just on how you do things, how much your knowledge is cognitive, but how do you go about putting it together with different types of teams and expertise. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I could never understand the education system we have in that you cram in as much information as possible and then you vomit it up in the exam paper and that's it. It absolutely has never made sense to me, and it certainly doesn't make sense to me in the context of your report here and how we need to be facilitating the education and the love of learning in our young people and the complex problem solving rather than doing it that way. And I really think we need to wake up. But I just want to ask you then, you see, what I suppose is contradictory is if you look at the word finances and even ourselves in terms of the ECB and all of that, so and our national government. So for instance, we have here a rainy day fund being set up. Mm-hmm. Now to me, okay, there is merit in that. But when you contrast it to being able to invest it in human capital, right through the life cycle, certainly in terms of lifelong learning, but from an early stage, and addressing even issues like homelessness, because if you have children living in hotel bedrooms, as we have here, thousands of them, we have 10,000 people who are homeless, then putting away a rainy day fund instead of investing in those children and investing in other children, then it doesn't make sense to me. Even looking at it purely economically in terms of the return that we get from it. I mean,
you're completely right, and actually we do, I was giving some example from East Asia, which is not a region that spends a lot of, it's a fiscally conservative region. Still, all of these countries, Malaysia, Singapore, Korea, have the equivalent of what you just mentioned, a rainy day fund that cannot be used unless it's natural, except for 2 reasons, natural disasters or education. So for education, these countries make an exception and say, we know that every euro spent today, and actually we have the latest numbers in our report, in terms of, if you're an economist, I'm an economist, I'm a former finance minister, so I believe in numbers and economic rates of return, and we've calculated them. If you're investing in physical infrastructure, you should invest in physical infrastructure, roads, ports, bridges and so on. In a good case scenario, your rate of return is 1 to 6. So in other words, by the time that the project is fully utilized, you would have gained €6 on every euro that you have invested. Primary education is 1 to 40, not even preschool, which it seems that it's higher rate of return. But if just the primary, the 7 to 10, 11 years of age, there are a number of studies by the World Bank, so it's 1 to 40. You invest €1 now, in 10 years you get 40 back, so the rates of returns are huge. For education overall, including secondary and tertiary, it's about 1 to 15, 1 to 20. So it's 3 times higher than returns to physical capital, which is why a number of countries, even for the rainy day fund, say two exceptions: natural disasters and education. One other area, and I mentioned it briefly, but we write a lot about it, is this area of, you refer to it, I'll call it social inclusion. That, of course, to have educated kids, these kids have to be healthy. A lot of being healthy is not having emotional troubles, being well fed, sleeping well, and so on. So it gets to the point of you need to care about the families as well. And this is an area where technology actually is worsening. While income inequality is not rising on average, as I mentioned, there is a significant part of the population that the standard social protection system does not capture anymore. People who work, but this may be part-time or flexible work arrangements, and their resources are not enough to fully take care of their kids. That is an issue. It's an issue in Europe, even though we have a relatively expansive social protection, but it's just not ready for the future.
I just think there needs to be better connect between the financial systems in the world, including the World Bank and other banks, in actually then taking heed of the report. So if we look at something like even the pressure around the promissory notes here, where we have to basically burn 14.5 billion euro, you know, if there was to be another approach to it, in that money could be invested in our children and in the human capital and in social inclusion, as you were saying, then our returns, you know, in the longer term would be far more than just satisfying some numbers on a sheet we're dealing with.
Indeed, and the World Bank has actually literally earlier this year pioneered what's called social inclusion bond. This is for client countries, not yet for Europe, but perhaps we should have discussions with the European Union and governments here as well, to serve exactly that purpose, because most governments and most politicians, research suggests, is that if they have the choice to invest in human capital, kids, people versus physical capital, or just have conservative budgets, generally human capital gets the lesser treatment. And not just this report, but a number of other recent publications and projects of the World Bank are making the point you need to change the returns, the financial returns. So in some countries, particularly in Africa and in South Asia, we have come up with this basically social inclusion bonds, where in some sense the World Bank steps in together with some member governments and organizes a financial scheme that makes it interesting for the financial markets to take up these bonds. And we only so far have 3 or 4 such experiences this year. It has been actually a very positive experience, and it applies to both emerging markets as well as advanced economies like yours.
I do think there needs to be a paradigm shift in thinking around it. I'll just ask you one final question. There are lots of the regions, even within this country, that don't have access to very basic telecommunications infrastructure like broadband. How important do you think it is that we invest in that?
It's hugely important, and we have calculations across a broad set of countries, including European Union countries, of how much this costs. It actually doesn't cost much. By now, technology has developed enough that broadband is available at not very expensive rates, operate in the global economy. In that regard, Europe in general has a lot to learn from other regions in the world. I was recently visiting Vietnam, which is still a much poorer country than many of the European countries. In our report, it stands out as a country that, in terms of human capital at the high school and primary level, is at par with most of Europe. So at first we were very surprised. How can Vietnam, with a per capita income of 1/10 roughly of European countries can afford it. The system that they have is truly something to consider. So every school has broadband. Even where there is no kind of standard electricity, they use solar panels, solar power to bring electricity and then through that broadband. So every week, every teacher in the country receives a set of scripted lessons. And this is both for access, but also for equality. So every teacher has to basically use these scripts for at least a minimum. So every student in the country receives this. This is about 200,000 primary schools and another about 70,000 secondary schools that every year, every week receive this. As a result, when you look at the scores of students in Vietnam, even in poor villages, they're very similar to Hanoi, to the rich cities. And actually, the bottom 10% of students, this is high school students in Vietnam, score better than the top 10% of the United States, to give you an idea of how this system works. I think Europe in general, and Ireland in particular, may learn quite a bit from this experience. It can be used not just in education, by the way, it can be used in health, which it is used in a number of countries, to the great benefit of particularly the population that lives in rural, less well-to-do areas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your...
Explore that further. Thank you.